So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Timothy Smith is from AppNexus. He is a Senior Vice President and General Manager of Global Technical Infrastructure and Operations. He's going to talk to us about what does 100% uptime really look like. Thank you.
Sure. Well, as they said, I'm Tim Smith. Unfortunately, I have nothing to sell you, so I apologize. Who is AppNexus? If you wanted to know, we're a ad tech player. We run a very large marketplace. We're the largest independent ad tech company out there. Obviously, Google is larger, and Facebook is larger, but in terms of independent players, we're the largest. It's very simple what we do. We sell advertising. We put buyers and sellers together. We facilitate commerce. Before you ask, a few things. We don't allow pop-up ads, so don't blame me. And autoplay ads, we mark them very clearly, and it's up to buyers and sellers to decide if they want autoplay ads. So we're just a marketplace. We facilitate commerce. That's the way I look at it. And we support billions and billions and billions of transactions every single day. So let's talk about some billions here. It's about 10 billion transactions on any given day. Some days it's a little bit higher, some days it's a little bit lower. Even when you get to the really busy holiday periods, these days, if you're looking at a quality plant and you have good anti-fraud and good quality control in place, we see about 10-ish, 12 billion. If you want to compare and contrast it, the way I like to think about it is we do more in a day than Visa, NASDAQ, and NYSE do in a month. And in fact, we do more in a day than I think the NYSE does in a year in terms of individual transactions. Obviously, they have a substantially larger gross transaction volume, so more dollars, but we just like to sort of joke that, yeah, that would be easy if we only had to do a few million a day. So they're very small transactions, and on any given day, like I said, we see, we have a lot of anti-fraud and quality controls in place, so we see about 300 billion opportunities to transact, and we generally filter out at least a third of them as just not being quality. So getting back to sort of the stock markets in the world, we don't close ever, 7 by 24. There is no closing bell. There is no time that we can take the plant offline. So we just have to keep it running all the time, and that's why the talk is 100% uptime versus 99.999. If we don't deliver at least 99.9 every single day, it's a really bad time, and it's usually 99.99, and for many months it's just 100%. It's not 100% all year, but it's pretty close. So how do you do this? I initially in the draft said, well, you cheat, but they said that probably wasn't the right way to talk about it. So what we do is we play stupid BGP and DNS tricks just like everyone else. We do BGP Anycast. I think everyone knows how that's done these days. I say we have a smart DNS server. It's not really smart, it's just not quite as stupid as stock bind. It has a little bit of decisioning in the back end. It's being replaced fairly soon with an outsourced global DNS provider. You can probably guess which one it is. It's not Dyn. So there's nothing very sophisticated that's required from DNS to do the highest level type of tasks. There's much more you can do over the long haul. We're working to get there over time. Everything absolutely must scale horizontally. If you want to achieve uptime and you want to have economics that work, everything has to scale horizontally, always. You don't ever want to get into vertical scaling because it increases the size of your failure domains, it blows your whole cost model. So very small failure domains, everything scales horizontally. Servers do break. On any given day, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2% of our server plant globally down. That's just how it is. So you figure out how to scale it, and you figure out how to do failover. Now, I did mention that, we're not 100% all the time. We are quite a bit. When you're doing very, very small transactions for very, very small amounts of money, and you're doing 5 million a second, if you drop 1 or 2 or 5 on the floor, it's okay. And we're talking about fractions of pennies out 3, 4 decimal places. So there is a little bit of wiggle room. So if you're familiar with ad tech, you sort of know how this works. BGP and DNS get involved, they get your traffic to the right place. It lands on a proxy. 9 times out of 10, it's probably Nginx, it's probably a software proxy. If you're in ad tech, some people still use hardware, but it doesn't scale really well horizontally. It's not very flexible. So we have this proxy that's sitting in the front, it's running Nginx, and it hands it off to the impression bus server, which we've cleverly named IMBUS. And IMBUS hands it off to a bidder server, which evaluates a ton of business objects, pretty much all of which are in Aerospike, and comes up with the various bids for the different clients and throws it back over to the IMBUS. And again, we've cleverly named this the bidder. Like I said, there's a lot of business logic in there. It's not just targeting, it's budgets, it's pacing, it's recency, frequency, it's all sorts of wonderfully fun, boring statistics. And then, of course, if you do transact, you need to generate a transaction record. And quite honestly, even when you don't transact, you're probably generating some sort of record so that you can go and do inventory quality, anti-fraud, and just general analytics. And then you do this about 5 million times a second. It's really fun. So, Aerospike and AppNexus, how long have we been doing this? I missed the keynote. I was a little bit late, but I heard they mentioned it. 2010, yeah. Is that Brian? There's Brian. I don't know if Brian still has a home phone, but when he did, I had it. Same thing with Srini. And for a while, we held him hostage in a conference room on 18th Street in New York. It's right above the Ann Sachs big black flags on 18th Street by Union Square. So we were their first customer. We were on something called Memcached from Schooner, if anyone remembers them. And it would fall over dead constantly. So somehow we managed to catch up with Brian and Srini at a conference, and they said they had this great Paxos thing that would be wonderful, and we should give it a shot. So we did. Like most things, the demo was better than the initial operating capability. That's how it works. So little things weren't there. Quick restarts, they were not quick. They were very, very long. They could be 6 or 8 hours. There was no XDR, so have fun figuring out what you're going to do there. If you really have super high mission critical loads and you don't have XDR, then you learn to live dangerously, which we did. It was fine. Didn't do backups. And really, we just called Brian and Srini around the clock. We gave them access to our server plant. They still have access. They've grown very well with us. We went from, I remember when we did our first billion transactions in a day. I don't remember anything between there and about 10 billion at all. It was just a little too busy. So they've been around, we've been around. So far it's worked out really well. Oh, the dreaded clicker fail. There we go. So what do we have now? We have about 18 different clusters. Some of those are very small, and they're not directly in the real-time path. Some of them are for doing a couple of interesting things post-processing. There's about 200 nodes. It's not a whole lot. There's 28 terabytes in the largest one. You know, by some standards, it's a lot of data. Other standards, it's not. And the big clusters are the ones that are in the real-time path, and there's at least one in each data center. So, West Coast, East Coast, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Singapore. All right, current architecture: 24 SSD clusters. It's because you can get 24 2.5-inch drives in a 2U chassis, so that's why 24. There's nothing magic about it. Why did we do the SSDs themselves? Because NVMe just wasn't here 3 years ago. We tried it, we broke it. Brian and a couple people at AppNexus have spent a lot of really fun times qualifying hardware. In fact, one vendor who shall remain nameless, which is not Intel, and it's not Samsung, and it's not HGST, but one vendor They sent us our gear. They sent their gear to us. We ran it through. We blew it up in about 2 hours. And they said, well, that's really interesting. We sent them the traces. They said, please do not buy our products. Come and see us in 3 years. We saw them in 3 years, and they said, yeah, just still don't. So, but if you really want to know whose NVMe devices, whose SSD devices are the best, talk to Brian, talk to the Aerospike team, because they test them extensively, and when someone wants to sell their gear to us, we usually say, well, go talk to Aerospike, run through their test suite, because we're just going to run it, and then we're going to run our own. And there's very few that are really reliable in the long term. The original Samsungs back in the day were awesome, and then they sort of abandoned the market briefly, and then came back. So 9 billion objects, billions and billions. Excuse me. The transaction rates, call it a million sustained reads a second. And yes, we do saturate those 10 gigabit NICs. We need more of them. We need 25s, 2x25, 4x25. And the response times generally fall in well under 10 milliseconds. That's our SLA internally, is that we need to provide the Aerospike lookups in 10 milliseconds. And to be quite honestly, they typically, if you look at the curve, they're down in the millisecond to millisecond range most of the time. Okay, technology, it's always fun. I know there's another slide. There we go. Oh, lag time. Okay, that's where we were. This is where we're going. So we replace the hardware every 3 years. We're not Google, we're not Facebook, we're not Microsoft. So we got to do things. It was rather interesting doing live swap outs early on. We did a little bit of front-end magic for a while. They were not very fun to do hardware forklift upgrades to swap out the old generation of servers for the new ones, but hey, XDR, it's really wonderful. So now we just do restarts whenever we want. We're doing maintenance in the middle of the day, we really just don't care. It doesn't matter. We've proven it over years and years and years and gazillions of transactions that we can reliably upgrade clusters, restart clusters, swap nodes in, swap nodes out. Well, not restart the cluster, restart the nodes. And everything just works reliably. Do we really do maintenance during peak request time? Sometimes, because since we're operating 7x24, it's hard to pick a good time that's going to work. We do it sometimes, it doesn't hurt, it's absolutely reliable, and I never say that, really. There's very few vendors who I like, and Aerospike is one of them, but not the first 5 years, right, Brian? Hey, it's been better, I don't call, I don't write, I just send money and everything works. It's wonderful. Tell you what, if we get enough exciting new things. Okay, operational experiences. It's really important. Hopefully you have a metrics environment. If you don't, get one. We use Graphite. So does pretty much the rest of the universe for the most part. It's old, it's slow, it works. We've replaced the back ends a little bit, and we've actually replaced the whole back end now with Iron UB from Circonus, and it's way less painful. But Aerospike has a lot of good data, so you really want to capture it. And don't think you can turn it on when you're having a problem and figure out what's going on because you're too late. So just capture the data all the time. Build for constant on metrics gathering, or you're going to have a bad time. It's amazing how many times we used to say, boy, this is sure expensive having this big metrics plant. Is it really worth it? And then we would have an issue and we'd just go back 5 or 10 minutes in time and be like, aha, we know what's going on. So look at their stats, and actually, at least on a monthly basis, make sure you capture them all and you retain them for as long as you reasonably can. At least on a monthly basis, take a look at what's going on. Look at your trends. Hopefully they're up and to the right. Hopefully your business is growing. At the very, very minimum, obviously your total cluster size. You have to look at your CPU utilization. You have to look at your network utilization. You have to look at your available percent. you know, error rates are kind of important, and obviously your device, are they full? And that, believe it or not, I think is how you do 100% of the time. It's a pretty short amount of slides. Like I said, I have nothing to sell you. I'd be happy to answer any questions I can, if anyone has any. Have at it. I think there's microphones on their way up to the front.
So just to summarize, are you network bound with Aerospike or CPU bound?
We're not CPU bound, we're generally network bound, but right now we have enough headroom that we're actually carrying 3-year-old gear and extending the lifetime. So we're not running at the red line now. We have in the past. It's really scary. It didn't break. You know, it worked. So.
For your kind of biggest data stores, can you talk a little bit about how the data is laid out, like for the user store, like user history? Is it one record for the user and you're doing appends to it, or is it lots of really small records?
Lots of really small records. We don't really do appends or updates. It's just objects go in, they live for a certain amount of time, and they get kicked out eventually. And we have 2 different style clusters. You can't have your phone vibrate next to a mic. We have SSD-based clusters that refer to the user data, and the segment data is in just rotating Rust-based clusters with lots of memory. So we actually have 2 distinct modes of using the platform.
A question here. How do you deal with eventual consistency issues, data integrity issues when you fail over from one cluster to another?
So what we always do, I might have missed a slide in here. Yeah, I did. So one of the things we do is we don't fail over clusters because the clusters always stay together. The last time we had an outage was in 2014, where we actually had to restart a cluster. And that outage was at least 50% our fault. We debated vigorously with Brian and Srini on whether uninitialized data should be assumed to be 0 or whether it can just be garbage. Turns out it's better if you 0 it yourself. So we haven't had an outage and a failover in at least 4 years, and that was one data center, that was one particular issue. And like I said, it was at least 50% our fault. So if you take it backwards further, I honestly don't think we've had a clustered down situation since 2012, Brian? Maybe 13.
I remember one in like 5 minutes in late 2011. That's when.
Yeah, it was right. It was in late.
2011, I think. It was 2011.
Yeah.
And we know exactly what it was. I remember it.
Yeah, it was 2011. It was at the very end of the year, so it's all kind of a blur. The one in 2014 was not that bad. We let a few things get away from us, and we actually restarted the cluster when we could have just backload off and it would have recovered. So we're just using the key value store features. We don't worry about eventual consistency. We're Luddites. We find something, when it works, we used to use all of the key value store, the core features. The engineering teams really haven't decided to go much further because they don't need it. It works really well for just doing straight, key value lookups. They're very happy. We don't do transactional things on the actual cookie stores, the object stores. So the segment data or the user data, there's no SQL, there's no transactions, there's nothing to worry about. When we do swap a cluster, if we're doing a forklift upgrade, there might be 2 or 3 racks of new gear coming in. We use XDR, we replicate over, we point all the reads over there, and we keep the replication going, and then we point the writes after all the reads are there and everything's stable. It's pretty rare to not actually have a product go down for, and of course, the East Coast is probably having a tsunami, and we're going to be down, but that's what happens.
For the read and write errors, what have those been leading indicators of?
Drive failures. Pushing drives for too long. We actually look at our write loads and the endurance, and we size them out and we try to keep an eye on it, but every now and then there's, I don't know, maybe a cosmic ray went through the fab, and some things just not right. But it's very rare. Once you get through qualification with Aerospike on your SSDs, your NVMEs, they generally don't fail. If they do fail, you can usually make them fail in 2 hours under the benchmarks. And if you run them hard for 8 to 16 hours, you're pretty much assured they're not going to fail. And if you run them for 24 hours and they don't fail, then that's a manufacturer you want to work with. There's some nuances there on firmware. We're a Dell shop. We deal with Dell a lot. We don't buy non-volatile storage from Dell because their firmware doesn't allow us to do things we feel we need to do. In particular, their firmware doesn't allow you to over-provision. They're trying to protect their enterprise customers. We're not an enterprise customer. We're willing to run with the safeties off, with the understanding that every now and then the torpedo is going to turn around and get us. So we're just very careful. You have to really have a good working relationship, definitely with Aerospike. If you talk to Intel or HGST or Samsung, they know who Aerospike is, they know what it does to storage, they know what firmware you should be on, and it will all work out pretty well.
We have one over here.
Okay.
Do you have any metrics that help you determine when an NVMe drive might be getting ready to go out?
That's basically what we're talking about. It's just the error rates on the drives. Retries. That's about it.
Okay. Thanks.
They really are, if you can get them through your initial testing and your initial burn-in, we've been shocked. Some of the drives are rock solid. Other drives will crater in the initial qualification test. Brian and Srini, I mean, how fast have you seen drives fail?
I think our benchmark is based on your experience actually, because you run for the largest amount of time with the most number of drives since early days. I think the first year we saw a few, I remember.
Yeah, but I mean, when you're qualifying new hardware these days, if it's not going to work, it's usually apparent very quickly.
Oh, yeah. Brian might want to answer that.
Yeah, so what we find is that if you push it really hard, it fails really fast. But the hard thing is the cases where it's going to fail 5 hours from now, right? You're right in sort of that edge range. So it looks like it's okay for the first hour or two. So you can push it so hard that it fails in a minute, but that's kind of easy, right? The hard case is sort of these brownout cases.
Yep.
So that's why we as part of our recommendations, we say 24 hours.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we've ever seen one that succeeds at 12 and fails at 24.
I don't
Maybe
think
there's
so.
an outlier. Frank?
Yeah, I work at Intel. I've been doing NVMe for 6 years. Our best customers test SSDs for 7 days. And I use the ACT all the time on all of our drives.
Yeah, we just find, I mean, typically what's going to fail, if it's the hardware that's going to fail, it's just going to fail. But usually what it is it's the firmware that's running on the drive.
Right.
It can't keep up with the housekeeping. Some of the Samsungs at one point had some issues, but they had a firmware rev that fixed this. And I'm talking 7 years ago, 8 years ago. So it's typically not the flash cells themselves that are failing. If you pay attention to the right endurance specs and you do the math, it's not really terribly hard. Just use bigger numbers than you think you could ever achieve and model it out. What you'll typically see though is the drives will get slower and slower and slower because they're not able to keep up with going back and doing the copies and the remaps. And then they get to a point where they essentially go into congestive collapse like certain network gear used to do.
You're on physical data centers, you're not on the cloud. What's the main reason for that? Control over the hardware?
Latency.
Price. Okay.
We've always stayed on initially we just had to do it, it's the 150 milliseconds, so we had to do it. We used to be virtual. We actually were founded as a cloud company and decided, hey, we probably shouldn't compete with Amazon. It's not a winning proposition. So we became an ad tech company. I'm waving my hand some because certain people may have had non-compete agreements, which expired. Suddenly we were an ad tech company, but that's how it goes. So we had to do it on site. You just couldn't do it with virtualization. We actually went to bare metal in our own cloud in 2010 because the Zen latency and the jitter were unacceptable. We just couldn't pay the tax. That improved over time, and when you're doing, we've actually looked at running the real-time plant on containers, we benchmarked it, and it's typically plus or minus 5%. So we don't worry about it. It's no more than a 5% tax. It's a little bit lower than that. So we're looking at doing more hybrid things, but for the time being, we came from doing it this way, and it turns out if you scale up to 10,000 servers or so, and you're really judicious in how you manage the economics, you can do it a lot less expensive than your cloud providers. No offense to any of them. We can do it for a lot less.
In your next generation, how many terabytes per node are you going to architect for Aerospike?
We're still debating. Our next generation will still be local storage. So the NVMEs will still be in the servers for Aerospike. Probably use something like an R640 from Dell. Like I said, we're a Dell shop. And we just haven't decided how many of those slots we're going to fill yet. We're in the process of doing all that right now. Everything else that we're doing, flash, will not be local storage. It'll be iSCSI across the wire. It's just way more economical. Anybody else? I see. I think I only got one plug-in for Chaconis and IronDB. I should probably plug the drive scale folks. If you haven't met them, you should. We're using them a lot, and we're pleased. Brian, Srini, any last thoughts? Haven't seen you in New York in a while. Actually, you were there. I don't think I made it.
I guess things are working well. No, I'm sure you're going to see us there. We do come. We're working.
No, we see you. I'm just giving you a hard time.
Yeah. So
It's more fun to torment Srini because Brian doesn't mind.
Well, okay. I guess I did. No, I think that was a great presentation. So
Okay.
I don't have any.
Yeah, all I can tell you is it's worked, and I never say that about vendors. It's worked. We don't view Aerospike as vendors. They're one of there's very few companies we work with we give direct access to our servers. Aerospike was the first and still has access to this day. We trust their people. They're very easy to work with, all kidding aside. It's really shocking how much it doesn't suck.
In a world of suck, you're awesome, Srini.
Hey, if you're thinking, if you're trying to compare it in your head against like MySQL or SQL Server or Oracle or even Vertica, it's just, no, it's an entirely different thing. You can run it to the limits, and you'd be surprised how far you can sort of push it past the red line when you have, exigent circumstances that demand it, like Black Friday or Cyber Monday or things like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tim, thank you.
Thank you.